Hi, I'm Alastair and I'm going to be giving the SSDC training video on principles. Okay, firstly with structure, I'm going to start off with some talk about strategy for principles. Secondly, I'm going to go on to how to run and how to rebut principles. And thirdly, core principle concepts. And just to note, this is going to be a mixture of more basic information that you may have heard in other presentations to an extent, and some more complex, maybe some more new observations for myself as somebody who's quite a fan of principle argumentation. Okay, starting off with strategy. So I think principles have a lot of different pros and cons. There's a general perception of some people that principles are quite scary and maybe not very good idea to run, either because they just don't like them themselves, they don't know how to do them themselves, or they worry that judges don't like them. I think on that last thing, there has happily been a kind of shift in BP culture to an extent in the last few years in favor of principles, which has made me happy. So I don't think that they're intrinsically something that people will discount, but I do think that there are concerns related to this, and I think there are other just intrinsic negatives, but there are also positives. Starting off though with the cons of principles, I think they have high burdens of proof. This is for a few reasons. Firstly, I think that sometimes this is intrinsic to the kinds of principles that people usually run, which tend to be kind of pass-fail by nature, as in it's something that you have to prove is intrinsically morally good in an absolute sense, some kind of rule or claim. And therefore, you really have to meet that as being kind of universal. If you do, then it's strong, but otherwise it kind of fails on its own terms, right? I don't think this is actually necessary to every principle, and I think you can find ways to prove this, which I'm obviously going to talk more about later, but this is a concern, a potential worry that you should think about with principles. Another reason why they can have high burdens is just because they are kind of difficult and different to normal kind of arguments to run, and they require different things, right? So it's high burdens, at least in terms of what people are expecting and what they're used to. And that's what I'm going to talk about especially in this presentation. But lastly, acknowledging what I've alluded to already, which is I think sometimes the high burdens are not there for kind of legitimate reasons, but more so to an extent from judges' biases, which I think do sometimes play into debating. As in, I think people often put kind of unequally high expectations on claims when in a principal argument, in a practical argument. I've been in adjudication where this happens with literally symmetric claims. They're just starting points of different arguments, one practical and one principle, and one is considered well enough proven and one isn't, even though they're basically just symmetric, though opposite claims, and had the same amount of proof on each side. But this is something that you have to be aware of and you have to think about in terms of the pros and cons of running principles. Secondly, they can be difficult for judges to intuitively place. So part of the reason that judges can be dismissive of principles, especially more so in the past, is that if they're not explicitly impacted and weighed, and even if they are, to some extent this is inevitable, that it's quite difficult to kind of compare apples to oranges in the way that you have to do when lots of other teams are making practical claims that are quite kind of quantifiable or just slightly more tangible, and how you weigh that up compared to more abstract, more kind of foundational claims. And this can be a reason to end up being told that, well, yeah, your principle is kind of good, but we were more persuaded by the practical claim ultimately. Or, you know, the reason that people, especially in the past, used to get away with really flippantly saying things like, okay, well, if your principle is about this actor, then you care about this actor, so that means just whatever happens to the actor in a practical sense is probably most important anyway, so we should just run that. It's because it's quite difficult to place them. Lastly, complexity. As I mentioned, there's just things that you need to do that are kind of unique to principles, and they are not necessarily as straightforward as being able to deliver at least a reasonably well impacted practical argument, right? Okay, having said all these negative things, why bother running principles? Okay, there are positives as well. Okay, scope and certainty, which I think is mentioned quite a lot in Tin's principle video, are a major advantage if you're able to pull off a principle, right? Which is that you often principles apply, especially if you're being strategic and selective with what you're running as a principle in the debate, apply very broadly, like to maybe everybody who's in some social class or social position, or maybe even just to everybody in virtue of their kind of human dignity or whatever, right? And therefore they are just have a wide scope, and this is a typical impacting and weighing metric. And secondly, certainty. They can often if you're proven, therefore be more certain even than well-argued practical claims, right? Because if, for example, you're in some debate about IR, you can give really good mechanization about why like China is going to do X, but we all know that there's a million factors that affect IR and it's really complicated and there's an inherent amount of uncertainty there. Whereas if you can give reasons why a principle seems kind of just foundationally morally true, then if the principle is clearly relevant to the motion, which I'll talk about later, then you just guarantee that there's something that is important that is being affected rather than just got some kind of likelihood. Okay. Secondly, distinctiveness, as in it's a good way to stand out, and this is important in terms of especially differentiation. I'll talk about that in a second. Lastly, clash isolation. So as I mentioned earlier, there's often questions about uncertainty, and a nice thing about principles is that they can often be insulated and isolated from maybe certain messy clashes in a debate about exactly how something plays out in a practical sense, or they can be more insulated from proving that something is fully effective if you can just prove that providing it is in itself a moral good. This is like if you watch Tim's principle video, he talks a lot about like the example of giving votes to the poor being potentially just good in and of itself, even if you don't have to prove that they're going to even use them, even if because it's just an obligation for the state to provide that option. And that means that you can, again, appeal a lot to sort of certainty with a principle. So you might be saying something more minimal, but it's more definite. Okay, so from what I've just said, there's kind of three times that are best to run a principle. First is a more like less of a kind of happy, yay, I love principles, and more of a kind of reality check, which is that you might just run them because usually an extension, your opening has turf burned lots of practical material. You don't know what else to run. There's a new practical argument. You're not sure what to do analytically, or you think that it's not enough to do there analytically alone to make a whole extension out of. And so running a principle can be a great way to, as I mentioned, be distinct, be clearly differentiated. Even if you can't prove that that's more important than your opening, it can be a great way to like not forth by just being derivative, right? And it could be a way to hopefully have something standing, because another thing about distinctness is that it means that, for example, if you're closing, the opening half is probably not thought about the principle. There's not going to be loads of preemptive sort of rebuttal, probably, at least maybe there's some, but probably not a lot. And so you're going to be able to get in there in a way with something new, something that's probably not been engaged with, and have kind of the first word, the kind of first mover advantage or whatever on this claim, on this new issue, a new way of looking at the debate. And it's also going to essentially kind of make judges wake up and pay attention to you and be confident that you are doing something new. Secondly, in extension and in opening, these cases are a bit more of a actually positive case about why principles can be good. So, as I mentioned earlier, in general, practical claims have a degree of uncertainty, and that is particularly true in certain kinds of debates, which maybe it's very difficult to prove that something is exclusive to one side, or it's difficult to know how a debate's going to play out, or debates where there's a lot of questions about marginality, whether different things are maybe just symmetric or basically indirectly symmetric, where there's different factors, but they ultimately lead to similar conclusions, etc. Right? In those cases, particularly in extension, it can often be effective to, as I alluded to earlier, kind of marginalize the debate and do something small and try to prove that. And that can be a practical claim, that can often work, but a frequent way of doing this is through a principle, right? Because for all the reasons I've said, it's differentiates and it's clear and it's precise. And as I said earlier, you can weigh, once you've done it, you can weigh it in particular ways based on its kind of scope and certainty, even if people think that principles intrinsically are a bit less important intuitively, right? Which they shouldn't, but they may sometimes do. And this also can apply to opening, especially if you're a bit more of an experienced debater and you are trying to run a sort of slightly more a clever opening that's insulating yourself and maybe covers different bases. You might want to include, while you're unlikely to make it probably like the thrust of your case in the way that an extension team is, if you're in a debate like that in opening, hopefully in opening you should be thinking still about how debates are going to play out and trying to isolate yourself from different teams. And what you might want to do is, as part of your case, include something principled in order to isolate yourself from the same risk, right? And to also importantly, therefore, take away your closing's opportunity to be the smug people who say, oh, we've isolated ourselves from this by running a principle. If you preempt that, you kind of choke them. Even if they could do a different principle, maybe it works, but it's not exclusively doing something really important in the way that it would have been otherwise. And it can be a way to mean that even if actually there's a lot of good rebuttal to your case, even if it was well made, that there's still stuff that's standing, especially because, as I mentioned right near the end of the debate, the presentation, people often kind of don't pay attention or tend to ignore or gloss over principle claims that people make, especially if it's a case that's like two main practical claims and then one more minor principle. Okay, so these are all key times when you might do a principle. Obviously, these are not exclusive, and they're also not hardened rules. You don't have to do a principle in these cases, and you can do them in other ones, especially if you're experienced enough to just do them well and just run them as arguments more frequently. But particularly if you're a bit reluctant about principles, or you're thinking, well, I want to use them more, but I'm not sure when. These are the key kind of examples of cases I would say it's particularly useful to. Okay. Appealing to judges. Okay, so here's a slightly more, you may have heard people make fairly similar arguments to what I've just mentioned. This is a slightly more specific argument that I want to make about making principles work. Okay, as I said, I think judges are becoming more amenable to principles, but I think there's certain factors that can really influence whether they're open to them or not, other than the biggest factor, which is just which judge do you have in particular, which is unfortunately kind of luck of the draw, and it can be helpful, though this is a bit sad, to kind of learn vaguely who your judges are and get a sense of that over time. But beyond that, how do you appeal to judges with principles? Okay, I think perceived reasonableness and perceived tacticalness are really important in terms of whether judges are likely to be more open and more on board with your principle as you're giving it, right? And I think a lot of the time, even if judges are supposed to be really objective, these kinds of factors of how kind of intuitively amenable they are to your case is going to make a difference to judging, right? So here's what I mean by those two things. So firstly, on perceived reasonableness, I think it's pretty self-explanatory in the gist, right? Is the judge hearing what you're saying that your principle is? And by the way, of course, you should be trying to make it really clear what your principle is. This is a thing that people do badly sometimes. But once they hear what your principle is, assuming they can understand it, do they think, oh yeah, I see where they're going. I see why they've done this. I see how this makes sense in this debate. Or are they like, that's weird. I don't know what they mean. I don't know where this is going. I don't know why they chose this. The more it's the latter, the less likely you are to get them on your side, right? So a few things. Firstly, how intuitive is the link to the motion? As in, is this a debate where you probably expect somebody to bring it up, at least in closing or something? Like a debate about criminal justice is often going to have some kind of principle, like the justice system is going to have some kind of principle aspect about, why the justice system matters, or victims, or rights to defendants, etc., right? Or is it something much more left field and maybe a bit more of a contrived connection to the motion? Secondly, how intuitive is the principle itself? So are you running something that people probably generally agree with, particularly, as I say, with the third thing, does it appeal to the judge's own likely biases? So is it something not just that the AIV, the average voter, is likely to agree with, but, the kind of typical political inclinations of a probably quite left-wing debating judge, are they going to be reasonably on board with it? I think this is also going to affect how likely they are to take it seriously. And secondly, on perceived tactfulness. Okay, firstly, was there other major material available? I think to an extent, if judges are thinking, why are they running this when there's this major argument they couldn't have, that they missed, or that nobody said yet, they're probably less likely to be on board with what you're doing. And secondly, if there is other practical material that maybe you're running, do they see it as being like cleverly kind of interwoven and interlinked with that, or do they see it as sort of awkwardly fitting in? I think all those things are going to affect the perceived persuasiveness and the likeliness to appeal to judges. None of these are hard and fast considerations because there's actually upsides and downsides to this. So, for example, if you can effectively run a quite unexpected principle that's maybe a little bit more contrived or just a little bit less of an uncontroversial principle, that can mean that you're firstly less likely to be like turf burned if you're in closing. Secondly, more difficult for other teams to respond to because they haven't heard the argument, like something about the state power principle or something over and over again and probably know the responses. And thirdly, I think to an extent you're going to maybe impress judges if you can do it well. Obviously, judges are not supposed to judge you based on the uniqueness or interestingness of your arguments, but they are human and this does happen to an extent, right? So actually not doing these things can be effective, but you're setting yourself up for a more difficult challenge. I think if you're not that experienced with principles, you probably want to try and follow these things in order to have a higher chance of success. But, do what you want. It's your debate in the end of the day. Okay, so these are all the general things I want to say about strategy. So now on to actually running principles. So now on identifying principle material. So firstly, of these 3 steps that I think you can use to do this, is to consider the average person's reaction to the motion. So essentially, the BP has a culture that is pretty utilitarian and often a little bit cold and calculating about how we think about debates. But if you see a lot of motions, like here's an example. This House would give medical decisions to a panel of experts, of technocrats. Think about how the normal person, like your mum or something, would react to this being proposed as an actual policy in the real world, right? And those are the things that you can run as principles. So, the normal person's response to that is probably going to be like, what the fuck, this is my right to have a role in that. Why do these technocrats get to tell me what to do in the hospital or whatever, right? And you have to do more than just say that to win a principle, obviously, but you also shouldn't embrace the kind of classic BP attitude of just saying, oh, well, none of that stuff really matters. It's all wishy-washy bullshit, right? You can use just normal people's intuitions as a good starting point for principles. It's the easiest way to think of principle arguments that are relevant to the debate, and it's the most likely, since these, as I say, you're appealing to normal people, to be something that your judge, even if they're a little harder by BP culture, probably has some kind of underlying attachment to themselves, and you're maybe going to be able to sway them as important. So this applies to things like democracy, free speech, kind of rights violations, like taking extreme actions for some greater end. All these kind of things in a lot of normal people would elicit a kind of reaction that probably is not going to be based on utilitarianism, but is going to be based on sort of broader principles that are common in society. Okay, if you've thought about that and you're not sure, or you want more ideas, now think about principles that are kind of implicit to the debate topic. So I already mentioned earlier things like debates about the justice system, where you might notice that even though people are generally talking about like catharsis for victims, etc., kind of fairly kind of consequence utilitarianist language for what you should care about in the debate, there's kind of implicit principle notions in this. So firstly, if we're talking about things like the victim's catharsis, we're not just like Benthamite hardcore utilitarians who think, well, if victims have more pleasure, then the overall expected amount of utility goes up. Because we tend to think, for example, that the victim being happy is a lot more important than their own, like the person who's the perpetrator of that victim's crime being happy, right? We don't measure utility equally. We actually think about justice in a more complex way that is not just purely utilitarian. And from that, you can note not just that obviously people often don't even realize they're not being utilitarian, but what you can actually do argumentatively with that is something like consider how, well, if we have this idea that's kind of central to the justice system that victims have special obligations, then I think that makes it much more intuitive that those obligations might not just be in terms of utility. They could have stronger or more abstract underpinnings, or they could just have particularly strong weight that goes to their utile impact, even if they are based in utility, right? So it could outweigh something that's a higher utility because of particular obligations, for example. And I think that's a thing that happens in a lot of debates, is that people have their underlying principles that are either implicit to the motion or what the topic is, or maybe implicit to the way that people are talking about the topic that you can exploit. Right, so another example would be if you have, so I think criminal justice is great for like underlying principles. I've seen people do the debate of whether you should lower burden of proof for crimes that have low conviction rate. And the opening government were kind of cautious in how they explained that, insofar as they said, well, you'd obviously still have to have certain kinds of evidence, etc., etc. And you can see a utile aspect of that, as in they're trying to minimize people being thrown into prison willy-nilly, right? But I think you can also often detect a kind of implicit discomfort with being completely cold and utile. And that's a good example of that in those kind of situations. Like, people seem to think that, well, it's sort of fucked up to just completely take away somebody's right to a fair trial. And that's basically something that they think is so kind of common sense that they're just like not really recognizing it as being a principal thing, or they don't want to concede it even if they want to run a consequentialist case. just so that they seem convincingly human and persuasive as having a case that is the judges should support, right? And that's how you can often and that's what you can often exploit to get to force principle clashes into debates, by saying that people basically are already actually considering them, but just not in a thorough and proper way, and they're not giving them the due weight that they deserve. Okay, lastly, run through central principle concepts. As I said, I'm going to go over this later. A lot of principle concepts, things like agency, etc., can come up in loads of different types of debates. Once you learn how to run them, there's bits of analysis that you can use over and over again, and you just have to apply them in different ways, right? And often, therefore, things that you have seen other people do, have done yourself in other debates, have the potential to be reapplied. And if that's generally, if you can't think of specific ways in the ways I've already mentioned, the most likely way you're going to come up with something. Okay, so these are 3 different ways to come up with principle material. I think if after all 3 of these you are struggling, you probably are not in a great position to run a principle and should try to do something else. Obviously, you're going to get better at these things the more you do them, but I would think that that's a fair rule of thumb. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how to actually give principles, but I want to start with how not to do it. I think that this is useful, partly rhetorically. Some of these things are kind of interwoven into the later slides, but I think it's important to flag them up here because they're really common mistakes. And also a few of them are a bit more extrinsic, and I just want to get them out of the way. Okay, so the first, sprouting a lot of philosophical terminology. This is sometimes a trap that I fall into. Try to not just be too abstract or unclear or niche to the point where you're confusing judges. Good judges are supposed to follow the metric that an AIV doesn't know terms like hedonic treadmill, etc., right? Or as I once used in the debate, something like epistemic credulity or something. And some judges are going to discount you because they're aware that you're saying stuff that you should be explaining rather than just using terms for. But other judges, like with the example I gave, are just going to be confused as to what you're talking about. If you are, for example, somebody who's a philosophy student and you're just over it, just forgetting that certain terms are more niche than you realize. So don't do this. Secondly, what is really common with kind of novice debaters, which is what I was kind of which is relevant to what I was mentioning earlier about kind of common sense intuitions, is that they will appeal to things that seem good and nice and are broadly popular, and just kind of stop there. So as I said, their instinct that well, it seems bad to give technocrats all the power over medical decisions because it's undemocratic, is the instinct that they have, and it's actually a completely legitimate instinct and something that you can run a principle on. But they just kind of end it there, either because, so I think popular culture has the kind of opposite problem of debaters, of just thinking that if you say something's democratic, it's good and there's nothing more to say about it, right? Rather than thinking, well, who gives a shit about democracy, right? But also, obviously, I think people don't know how to actually give that analysis, and that's what's going to be coming up in this presentation, right? But just appealing to things that sound good is really not going to get you very far, and it's very easy for you to be dismissed by other teams and by judges. So make sure that whatever is a kind of foundational concept in your principle is explained to be important and not just asserted to by, even if it appeals to some kind of common sense idea. Okay, thirdly, undermining a principle by being overcautious and conceding to contradictory metrics. So this is another thing I've seen novices do. Once watched a novices debate about euthanasia, and a team ran a gov case for euthanasia that was well, the 2 highest principles, or the 2 highest obligations of the medical system are to give patients choice and to give them the best health outcomes. And we're trying to run, therefore, that you should have euthanasia because of choice. But you'll note that these 2 principles are kind of intrinsically in tension with each other in the entire point of a debate about euthanasia, potentially, right? As in, obviously, you might actually say that certain cases of euthanasia are, also beneficial to people's utility. But if you're saying that people have a right to, euthanasia, then you're saying that you're going to give them the ability to do something that might be considered harm themselves because it's within their own choice, right? So you cannot concede or try to hedge against things that are directly contradictory to the logic behind a principle, right? Or it shows that you don't even buy it yourself, or you want to think committing it. So why should the judge? Okay, next. Not explaining the relevance to the debate. That's going to come up in a minute. It's really important. And lastly, are just things that people fail to do. Again, not being comparative about how the principle is actually being impacted, and not impacting or weighing, which, as I mentioned earlier, because of the kind of abstractness of principles, is really important. And if you don't do this, judges are just likely to be dismissive of them. Okay, so what should you actually do? Okay, so to give a principle successfully, you basically have two main burdens. Firstly, you need to prove that the general principle is true, as in there should be some underlying broad moral claim that you're making, which you need to substantiate. And secondly, you need to prove that that principle that you've just proven exists is relevant to this motion. On the former, I think the two main things to keep in mind are intuition pumps and moral frameworks, and I'm going to explain those. And on the latter, I think this can mean a couple of different things depending on what kind of principle you're doing. So usually you're going to talk about some kind of moral principle that is kind of non-utilitarian, and you need to say why it's being uniquely upheld or violated by the debate, by this particular motion, to a meaningful degree. But there are also slightly different kinds of principles you might run, which I've alluded to earlier with the example of maybe considering the rights of victims or the utile effects on victims to be particularly important, even if you're appealing to utility, right? Where you might sometimes run a principle which is explaining why certain consequences in the debate are intrinsically more important than others. And when you're doing that, you obviously need to link this principle to exactly the kind of consequences that have been discussed and which it applies to and how that affects the weighing of consequences in the debate. So, for example, I wanted to debate about a daughter's obligations to her parents, and I ran like 4 minutes of analysis in rebuttal in whip to an opposition team who were trying to argue that you have certain obligations to make your mother's life good. And I tried to run like loads and loads of reasons why you should actually just prioritize yourself and not care about your mother in this particular way and not prioritize them. And this is an example of then what you need to do is link that claim, which what I was trying to say is that self-interest and especially is more important than especially like non-consented relationships that you have to other people, and how that links to the particular impacts in that debate, which were all to do with like your educational opportunities, etc. Okay, so talking about the first. Okay, so now on providing moral frameworks, which is part of proving your principle in a broad sense. So this kind of has three aspects, so these are kind of interlinked. One is specifying a metric, as in just what is the principle that you are talking about, right? What is the thing that you are valuing? Basically, generally a principle is about proving that what is right, what is good, is not reducible to just a utilitarian metric. So you've got to therefore identify what's missing from the utilitarian picture. So it might be we're not considering deservedness, we're not considering agency, we're not considering certain principles that we should never violate, even if they have good consequences, etc. And that's the thing you're specifying as a metric. And then you want to explain why that thing actually matters. And lastly, you want to explain why it's not reducible to utilitarianism. So you need to try and be careful that you're not just kind of dressing up consequentialism in a way that other teams can just kind of therefore co-opt your claim. You have to explain why it's actually uniquely distinct from other types of consideration that just weigh on like consequences. Okay, so I think a few bits of advice firstly, and then an example. So I think often principles, in terms of providing a framework and explaining what it is and why it's important, can be well thought of in terms of how to get that across by appealing to kind of an ideal world or how ideal systems or sets of rules would work, right? So if you talk about, for example, the right to a fair trial, I know I keep bringing up criminal justice because it's just a very easy example of principle stuff. There's a kind of idea of what an ideal system is. Or another example would be the government, where you might think, well, given certain moral factors about how the state treats us and what rights we have, here's kind of ideally how our relationship with that system should work in order to make it just, etc. So giving a sense of how things ought to be in a broader sense is therefore engaging with kind of principles rather than engaging with just kind of practical stuff where, usually consequentialism, you can just be quite down in the weeds because it's kind of about just comparing X to Y according to a kind of brute metric, like the amount of pleasure or suffering or whatever, right? Whereas often non-utile material is about kind of broader ideals of things that matter, and therefore kind of giving that wider context is quite important to making them clear as to what you're talking about and why, and making it persuasive that it matters, right? Okay. Secondly, just in terms of what I mean by irreducibility, the important thing is that it should generate different prescriptions to utilitarianism, as in what you're saying, what the implications of the principle being true are, mean that you would think that different things are right or wrong and act in different ways accordingly than otherwise. Or you want to prove that it's kind of irreducible because it's something kind of prior, which is what people say in debating a lot. And it's kind of a vague term in a philosophical sense, but essentially kind of foundational to an idea of utilitarianism. So that might mean saying something kind of meta-ethical, as in, well, what it means for something to be moral is partly to do with a kind of certain kind of social arrangement, a sort of constructivist idea of morality, and that is dependent upon something like, for example, agency. Or kind of epistemologically, we might say something like, well, our perception of what's good comes from kind of individuals having moral preferences, and therefore, again, something like agency might be a basis of why we value utility and therefore more important or not just reducible to it. Okay, here's an example to make it a bit more clear about what you might be doing. Say you want to prove something about bodily, like that people have a kind of right to bodily autonomy. I'm not going to be that specific about what the debate might be, because the point is that here's a broad moral framework, right? So here's basically what you want to prove. Individuals have a special right to decide what is done to their own bodies. And as is mentioned by irreducibility, that right holds even if violating it could have some kind of utilitarian benefit. So a classic example would be, if I'm sitting in a hospital room, you cannot just kind of knock me out in the waiting room and steal my kidneys to give to two random patients without my consent, right? Even if that would, save their lives and they would die otherwise. Most people have the moral intuition that that's wrong. And that's a good starting point. But to prove this, you want to give reasons why, as in deeper reasons. So a few things you want to do. Firstly, or a few things you could say. So firstly, might argue that this person has a kind of right based on a broader notion of being a stakeholder. So in the same way that, for example, a parent probably has certain rights or more say about things that their child does than another person, or somebody, or a citizen has more rights about what their state is doing than a non-citizen. This is probably because they're a stakeholder, and they're directly affected particularly by the thing that is being decided upon, right? And therefore they have some kind of right to a say. And you can say the same thing about somebody's body, right? So if you're going to affect somebody's body in a certain way, like medically, physically, etc., that person is the only person who has to live within that body 24/7, has to therefore feel the consequences of it happening, or has to have, even if it's a more abstract consequence, like the harm of somebody writing their initials on your kidney when you get surgery without telling you or something. They have to kind of be aware that their own body has been violated in that unique way, and that gives them some kind of right that therefore means that they should have a say over how their body is treated. And an obvious example of being a kind of major stakeholder in terms of bodily autonomy violation affecting you would be something like abortion, right, and how pregnancy affects you. Secondly, you might want to subsume it into a broader claim about something to do with self-ownership, as in, well, you just have an ownership right to your body. It's yours, and therefore you can do what you like with it in the same way that applies to other things. If you want to justify that kind of claim, you might talk about how, well, giving somebody self-ownership of their body is basically a way of respecting their personhood, as in you're differentiating them from a common object, like, a random apple in a tree in a field is something that's kind of a common object that people can expropriate and use as they like, and they don't have kind of born and unique natural claims to. But your body is importantly different to that, as in somebody cannot take your body and do what they want with it. This would be like slavery. And the way that you make sense of that being morally wrong and why there's a unique difference is that, well, the ownership claim exists there to the body that the person has, whereas it doesn't exist to the random apple on a tree that neither of them have found yet, right? And so that maybe you want to say what you can often try and do with principles, right, is say that by denying that some principle holds in a particular case, it kind of undermines a very foundational moral idea, and this is an example of that, and therefore it seems to lead to a kind of absurdity. Then you want to talk about the importance. So And I think I've already talked about sort of abstract metrics of importance, but it can be nice to be, without just reducing its consequences, don't do that, but try to be a bit more tangible, especially for judges who don't like abstract stuff too much, right? So why is bodily autonomy important? So from what I've just talked about like respecting somebody's self-ownership and their right to not be like treated like an object or a slave or whatever, right? You can see that it links to kind of protecting people against sort of tyranny, arbitrary power that controls their body, right? It makes people particularly able to have a kind of mechanism of privacy and defense from exploitation in examples like, for example, abortion. And secondly, you might say that just something to do with like your own sense of dignity, as in the perception of violation is particularly strong. Obviously, this is more like a practical claim, but in a broader principle context, it kind of has arguably a greater meaning applied to it. And I think irreducibility was already kind of clear with the principle, like the example I gave of like harvesting somebody's organs, where you should be able to see that if you were just a pure kind of cold-hearted utilitarian, we would like take people's organs that are not vital and distribute them to the people who need them the most. I mean, maybe that might not be utilitarian in practice because of like people being freaked out or running away from hospitals or something. But say like if we could do it on a one-off basis and know that nobody would know, then it would be utilitarian. But presumably it would not. Clearly, it would not respect people's bodily autonomy, and presumably most people would think it was wrong, even in that kind of one-off instance where you erase everybody's memory afterwards. So hopefully that's an example of how you can run through a principle. You start off by claiming in clear terms what it is. You then try and say, here's the like different reasons to justify it, and you appeal when you do that, you appeal to broader principle claims, to broader moral notions that seem pretty self-evident and pretty undeniable. And therefore you create a strong sense that this is a kind of framework that has a sort of holistic validity to it in terms of considering whether things are moral or immoral. Okay, intuition bumps. So you might have noticed, if you know what intuition bumps are, that the example of the organ donor case is already an intuition bump, because I just think that intuition bumps are pretty foundational to giving principles and making them clear. But explaining them in more detail here, and then I'm going to talk about delivery structure. An intuition bump, for people who are unaware, is basically just a real or hypothetical case where the principle seems to self-evidently hold, i.e. where considering the principle is central and irremovable to our assessment of its rightness or wrongness. As I mentioned with the organ donor case, it is presumably in virtue of bodily autonomy that we don't think it's okay to, like, as I said, maybe when somebody's asleep in surgery, for the surgeon to tattoo their name or write their name in their organ, even if it doesn't do them any physical harm, right? It's presumably because bodily autonomy has some kind of foundational moral importance, and therefore the case is effective in highlighting that moral intuition exists in people, right? The point of intuition pumps is to help, as I've said somewhat tongue-in-cheek here, kind of robotic BP judges to realize that they do actually often value a lot of principles, maybe more than they think they do. As I said, they might think that these things are kind of wishy-washy, but they might be very uncomfortable with the consequences of actually accepting that sort of only utility in a very strict sense is important. And therefore, they're really important to getting judges on board with a principle and to making them seem impactful. So that will relate to, this point relates to the structural claim I'm going to make about delivering principles in a second. The important thing to note is, like, coming up with intuition pumps is a skill that you learn. You can often reuse many of them, as in I've used certain intuition pumps many times, because as I've said, principles can often be applicable in a broad sense in many different specific ways. But if beyond the fact that you're just learning how to come up with intuition pumps, if you have some sense of that, but you can't find cases where your principle holds, it's probably a bad sign in terms of it being a principle that seems to have strength as a moral framework in the first place. So it's a good test of your own principle to consider whether examples that would appeal to it would actually be on your side or not, and whether therefore maybe it's very strategic to run, whether it's actually going to be persuasive. Okay, how do you give effective intuition pumps? So effective intuition pumps should be clear and simple. We need to know what you're getting at, why it's related to the motion, and not be too convoluted, and ideally not too weird, just because people will often be dismissive of thinking that like weird cases are just sort of less helpful as moral barometers. Secondly, they should ideally make the principle just seem obvious, as in you want to try and find a case that's like as uncontroversial seeming as possible, especially considering like the AIV and, as I mentioned before, like judge biases. They should be to the degree emotive and moralistic. Don't commit an equity violation of being too explicit, but within the realms of not doing that, it's good to find something that's like actually has some moral weight behind it. Like I don't know, I once gave a POI to somebody about whether they would lie to their grandparent about their other grandparent having died or something. Maybe that was an equity violation. I hope not. But okay, next. Okay, I already talked about targeted judge sympathies. Lastly, difficult to rebut. So just try to be preemptive and come up with the intuition pumps that are actually thorough and are not vulnerable to debunking. Specifically, how you can debunk intuition pumps and therefore how you should preempt it is going to come up in a minute. So, but try to think through how you might respond to your principle and give ones that are not going to be vulnerable to that. Okay, now proving the relevance of the principle to the motion. As I said, in a vacuum, a principle might be true, but it doesn't get you anywhere unless you've explained why that wins you the debate, right? So to do that, you need to think about, firstly, who are the actors in the debate that this principle is like bearing on, like who holds the rights that you're claiming exist or something, or who should not intrinsically act in the way that you're saying it's wrong to act in, whatever, right? You need to be clear about who it is you're talking about and why it applies to them, and in this case, right? So, as I said, you either can do that through sort of specifying or subsuming. So there might be something specific about this case that makes the principle apply, if it's a more kind of nuanced principle that applies in certain instances. So this is where all of like Tin's complex stuff about obligations and reparations comes in, right? So you have to say why, for example, there's a particular the kind of obligation that you've talked about existing in abstract, like a kind of moral obligations that exist in certain contexts, is particular to this case because there's a certain degree of proximity, a certain degree of culpability for a wrong, a certain degree of capacity to deal with the problem at hand or something. Or in terms of specifying, it's things like why, again, I think Tin talks about this, self-defense applies to a certain case because it's a proportionate amount of defense and there's not another option and it's going to have some degree of efficacy or something, right? So sometimes you have to be more precise about exactly why a principle applies to the debate. And then it's really important to do that work, right? And not just say, well, self-defense matters, and not say, yeah, but why is this the right type of self-defense, or why is it sufficiently appropriate in this case? And by making it specific, you can lower your burden, as in, if you said, well, yeah, self-defense matters in these instances, then it's harder for the other side to just try and find counterexamples that make your principle seem silly, because you've narrowed it and explained and justified why it's narrow in a way that makes it harder to do that. But secondly, you can just have a kind of assumption point where if you have a more broad principle, as in some kind of right that basically everybody has or a large number of people has, it might just be that by explaining why the principle matters, all you basically have to say is, well, these people are part of that broad principle, as in some kind of right to autonomy, for example. Is just something that these people have. But I think what you need to do in those kind of cases particularly, nonetheless, even if it seems a bit more straightforward to do that, is to really analyze the impact and impact it on the comparative. As in, the problem that people can have is not justifying why the principle is exclusively met on one side and not the other. They either don't meet a burden of proving that it's good enough, or it seems symmetric or achievable in other ways, right? And importantly, you want to therefore justify why the fulfillment is sufficient. As in, often your principle is not going to be perfectly implemented in some sense, or there's going to be some doubts about that. So, for example, something about like giving truth to people, like revealing a truth, people can often rebut and say, like, well, it's likely, even if it's principally good to reveal truth to people, well, there's going to be some distortion inevitably in the process. So they'll say, well, you haven't really met truth anyway, so your principle doesn't matter or something. So that's why you need to try to be preemptive and to try and find ways of proving that even if a principle maybe intuitively, if teams have good responses to you, is not going to work in a completely perfect way, is still morally important, right? So you can either do this by talking about a sliding scale. So you might say, for example, on truth, well, the closer to a kind of true narrative that you're giving to people who have been deprived of truth, the better they're being treated in terms of their own dignity and agency. And that's a greater moral benefit, even if it's not an absolute moral win, right? Even if there's still some amount of injustice that remains. Or you might want to appeal more so to a tipping point, as in, for example, maybe on the thing like self-defense, or with the example I mentioned a while ago about giving rights to votes to the poor or something, how, well, even if there are certain lots of negative things that maybe apply to this group, like on this particular axis that you've specified, this is enough to meet this particular injustice, as in this is, like, even if imperfect, just meets what kind of threshold exists. And maybe the way to try and do that is to give analogies of other cases where it seems like, well, while something isn't perfect, it is fair, it is reasonable enough. Like maybe on democracy, you might say, look, most people would probably agree that the UK political system is flawed in a lot of ways, but would also agree that people probably have their democratic rights like broadly met in the UK. And therefore, if you can achieve that amount of democracy in like, some debate about like a post-conflict state or something, then that's sufficient for people's democratic rights, right? Okay. Just more actually practically delivering the principle. So I think first you want to provide the TLDRs and the too long didn't read, if people don't know what that means. Start out, while I've broken this into steps, and I think that's how you should actually give the bulk of the principle, you want to start out as much as possible just making it clear where you're going, what you're talking about. Because as I said earlier, with judges being on board with your principle, if they don't really know what you're getting at, especially if you're not like a more sort of well-known debater who they probably think, oh, I don't know where this is going, but it's probably going somewhere good, right? Some people I think get away with that, but if you're not if you're not one of these people, you probably want it to seem like you know what you're doing, and judges can have a sense of what the point you're making is, right? So you really just want to set out on the start like a kind of 1 or 2 sentence version of what your principle is and what you're going to do, right? But once you've done that, you want to go through these steps. So proving the principle. I think an intuition pump sandwich is a kind of good structure, right? Because as I mentioned, I think they're just really central to moral frameworks. So you kind of want to start probably with something that's like an intuition that's a starting point for the principle, as in it gets judges on board with the idea being broadly plausible as a moral principle that they care about, and makes them emotionally kind of see where you're coming from rather than it just being too abstract. I've used a slightly unpleasant analogy before. This is sort of slightly foreplay for your actual hardcore principle analysis, right? Secondly, then once you've done that, it's an inroad to give, as I said, the more structural, complex explanation. And then at the end of that, judges may have a feeling of, okay, well, now they give me a bunch of abstract stuff, but why do I really care about this? Or like they might slip back into the sense of, okay, it sounds important, I guess, but it's not like how many people are dying, which seems worse to me. So that's when you want to like throw back to your intuition pumps and say, well, like use something different. Obviously, don't just repeat yourself. Where you can say, well, look, I'm giving you another example where you probably feel quite uncomfortable just dismissing this as being kind of abstract, and you actually feel like it has substantial moral weight. And that is going to make it seem like you've fulfilled your burdens in a holistic sense by meeting the kind of intuitive and the kind of analytical expectations that judges have. And you've done it in a way that's, as I said, probably more just sort of rhetorically persuasive. Something which makes the point clear in its importance, which actually is in the judge manual as a way that debate styles should be considered. Then obviously you need to explain the motion's relevance in the ways that I've just talked about. Try to be precise as possible, and that's going to lead on to impacting and weighing, right? You want to say who exactly it's impacting and how. Maybe you want to appeal to metrics, particularly because you're running something weird, probably as a principle to an extent. Excuse me. It's good to be able to say, well, here's the kind of like bog standard mechanism, metrics for impacting and weighing that I can then appeal to, like as I said earlier. Capacity, certainty, vulnerability, etc. If you can do all these things, then you can make the principle seem grounded in normal debate doing and make your judges not be too confused about what you're talking about, right? And as I've said before, if your principle was well proven in the steps that I've mentioned, it should be relatively easy to do this in terms of metrics and kinds of things like certainty. But another thing to consider is this, like your principle might not be perfect, but usually you can still get somewhere with it, especially because other teams are probably not perfect either. So you probably want to try and have a kind of insulated, like, especially if you're like the second speaker and you're trying to weigh a principle. In your case, you may want to hedge against the idea that you did some things not as well as you could have done and say why it still matters to a degree. So, for example, even if it's not fully proven, you might say that you might try to be comparative and say that there's still greater analytical work given towards it than other claims in other teams, or still a relatively higher degree of certainty. You might want to point out the lack of engagement which can happen. Or you might want to suggest, for example, if you're a closing team, that even if they don't buy that the principle is more important than practical things, that it still should be weighed as being moral. You can point out the elephant in the room that, like, the judge manual says that you shouldn't just dismiss principal things, and therefore say that your principles should get some degree of attention, even if it is not perfect, or even if other teams might be beating you, right? This is the best way to not come forth, which, when you start running principles, might be one of your main concerns. Unfortunately, is a bit of a learning exercise. Okay, engagement with your principle. So other people are going to be responding to your principle in the debate to an extent, or hopefully at least, and also you probably want to engage actively to an extent. So I think it's good to try to push people to engage with your principle. So for example, if you're closing, do things like POI people with intuition pumps and try to get them on board. The best feeling ever is when you ask somebody an intuition pump, they give you the answer and then they give you the answer on the other side that you wanted to hear in order to prove that your own principle is true, right? Doesn't always work, but it's fun. Sometimes people are just confused, so try to make it clear what you're talking about. You don't have to do this, but I think it's good to flag your principle and give other people a chance to engage with it, even though obviously it leads to more opportunities for rebuttal. Secondly, as I mentioned a minute ago, people sometimes just ignore principles that you've given. Call this out. If you're opening and nobody said anything about your principle, and it's like the whip speech of the other side, and you don't have a really important piece of rebuttal to give, you might just want to say, hey, you completely ignored this principle. This is something that people should consider. Or if you're whip and the other whip, like if you're op whip and the other whip just hasn't responded to your principle, you might say, hey, this was an actual argument that you should have given attention to. And as I mentioned earlier, you could again kind of draw attention to the fact that, hey, judge, you're supposed to consider principles, and if people just completely ignore them, they should probably get some merit, right? Secondly, call out straw manning and misinterpretation, whether deliberately or not. And I think it happens both a fair amount. People often respond to principles in a way that's like really misinterpreting them or really uncharitable to them, right? They try to, for example, take your intuition bump, completely bad faithfully twist it into meaning something you didn't mean, and then say, well, that's obviously not true. Or they try to just sort of take your principle and respond to what other principle it sounds a bit like because they weren't listening that closely, right? Pointing out these things is an easy way to try and show this, and especially because I think sometimes judges can fall for this kind of stuff if people do it persuasively and in a kind of derisive sounding way that's rhetorically persuasive. So just make sure that judges are not buying people bullshitting about your principle by insisting that and pointing out that they are doing this and that's not what you actually ran, right? Lastly, if you do get pushback on your principles, remember the thing I mentioned earlier about the euthanasia case, and this can often happen with engagement, where people need to be careful about what they concede when there's pushback on a principle. Sometimes you just need to bite certain bullets, and if somebody's kind of criticizing your principle or saying, oh, well, surely that means this or something, if they're trying to say that at least there's some implication, and like thinking about it, it actually does, and if you don't accept the implication, then the principle kind of doesn't work. Bite the bullet. Like, don't just concede something unless I guess they've told you that it implies something extremely disequitable that by even accepting you're going to get in trouble for, right? Except for in those circumstances, hold your principle and be confident in it, even if maybe it is a bit bullshit in reality, right? Don't run away scared. Keep your confidence up. Okay, rebutting other people's principles. So, especially if you're like the whip speaker, you can point out how they have probably failed to meet some of the aforementioned burdens, as it's very common that people will do this as principles are kind of difficult and people are not super familiar with them, right? But beyond that, okay, try to do a reductio of their moral framework. So this is kind of what I just mentioned in terms of responsiveness to difficult cases, where if somebody's given a principle, you want to basically do a reverse intuition pump with cases that you can find that are entailed by their moral framework. So if you can say, well, you've given this moral framework and it sounds really nice and abstract, but really it would lead to us having to believe X and Y, and believing X and Y is pretty absurd. This seems like a pretty good response to the moral framework not being true, especially if you could provide therefore maybe a less extreme, a more kind of mild version of a moral principle that would accommodate some of the other side's claims maybe, but without having as strong implications. Okay, responses to intuition bumps specifically. Firstly, you might want to show how the intuition pump is actually just reducible to utility or some other uncontested moral claim. A good example of this is because often people just don't give great intuition bumps. I once did a debate where somebody tried to say, like, well, workers have an obligation to be paid by their worker, and my intuition pump for this is, it's bad that like the workers in Amazon warehouses in like Central America are underpaid. And my response to this was like, well, if I'm a utilitarian, I also probably think that like really poor people having no money is bad. I don't have to think that there's some special property right to be upset about that, right? That like Jeff Bezos is hoarding all of his wealth, all these poor people like can't afford to eat, right? And this shows how you should try to insulate your principles. As I said, I try to give intuition problems that aren't vulnerable to that. For example, there is a much better intuition problem that is basically along the same lines, where you can say something like, it would be bad for my boss to agree to pay me, obviously like employ me and implicitly or explicitly agree to pay me, and then say, oh, actually I gave your paycheck to like give well to buy malaria nets or something, even though that's a more utile, a more charitable, a better utilitarian cause than giving it to me, because it's my fucking money, I earned it, right? And this is not reducible to utility for the reasons I've just given. Okay. Second, explain why the intuition it produces is unreliable in some way. So first you might say, well, the example just wasn't clear enough, which is not uncommon. You could say that it could actually just be interpreted to mean something completely different. Maybe that's what's confusing our intuitions. Secondly, it might be too abstract or weird a case to have reliable intuitions about. So I mentioned this earlier kind of. You might want to argue, for example, that, well, our moral intuitions are probably designed for like normal cases. So if somebody is giving some really weird hypothetical, it's probably just not that relevant to what's actually morally good, what we happen to think about it, because it's just not how our like moral intuitions are designed to work. Lastly, you might say that it's just explicable or reducible in terms of sort of arbitrary psychological biases. Like, usually people give this a claim, at least in philosophy, and like ones that I do actually just think are still true intuitions. But people will try and say with like whether you should throw somebody off a bridge to stop a trolley car or something. Well, we just have a kind of status quo bias, so we think that like, we wouldn't pull the person off the track, but you also wouldn't throw them on, so you just have a kind of status quo bias. Or maybe we're just more squeamish about things to do with direct acts of violence because they're associated with like sociopathy or something, and it doesn't actually make them morally wrong or something, right? These are the kind of things you might want to say. Lastly, you can assume or posit that the principle is true, but question that the motion is like sufficient to meet it. So I gave an example earlier of this where you might want to be saying with somebody's principle about truth that, well, they're not really meeting it anyway because there's too many problems in this with implementation or something, right? So often a principle might sound nice, but just not really work out, as I said, because the real world is always messier than the abstractions that as I mentioned, are kind of essential to making a principle seem true in the first place. Okay. Lastly, a little bit on kind of core principle concepts. Okay, so massively popular thing, which I've already mentioned a few times, is agency and autonomy. And the TLDR of this is basically sometimes letting people have what they want is more important than giving them what in abstract seems like the best thing. Okay, and this is relevant to all kinds of issues to do with freedom, like your personal liberties to take drugs or have certain types of sex or whatever, right? These are what you might call negative rights, usually. So it would be things that it seems bad for people to intervene on your capacity that you already have to do it, right? Like the state to stop you. I mean, obviously, whether it seems bad is up for debate, but right, that's the idea. Secondly, things like choices and opportunities, and these are more like positive rights usually, so things that should be provided to you by society, essentially. Like maybe like, for example, your society only really giving you very limited choices about the work you do or the parties that you can, like kind of political parties that you can support or etc. It's a kind of loss of a kind of like a positive freedom. Or opportunities, like a lack of meritocracy, a system where some people get ahead just by kind of nepotism or whatever, is one where you don't really have kind of freedom because you're not kind of able to utilize your skills and abilities in a way that's fairly recognized and rewarded by society, right? Okay, secondly, consent. So this leads to stuff to do with like anti-natalism, stuff to do with like the state having power over you, even though you didn't, whether or not they have a right to continue, you didn't consent to it, whether you have obligations to your parents versus what obligations they have to you. Comes up all the time, and it's kind of foundational to agency, as in presumably the reason that you should be able to consent to decisions is because decision making is a thing that's important, right? Okay. Representation, participation, right? So kind of having a degree of agency and a degree of autonomy might be to do with things like a stake or an influence in a system that affects you and you're a part of, right? So like being able to vote, for example, gives you some agency because you can have an influence on what the laws are that you have to abide, or being able to participate in the economy in a significant way, for example. Okay, arguments you might give as to why they're important. So you can often talk about principles maybe in terms of being greater than utility or prior to utility. So greater than utility, you might say, well, firstly, something you can say about utility in general is that there's a lot of uncertainty about consequences in terms of just you don't know what's going to play out, and you don't necessarily know what people's preferences are. Even if you know what the consequences are, you don't know how people will feel about them, basically, right? Another thing you can talk about is how it seems like when people have choice over certain types of pleasure or pain, it just gives them, it kind of affects their moral weight in an intuitive sense. So, for example, I've seen debates talk about this where it's like, certain people are choosing to abstain from sex or marriage, or they have certain religious practices that maybe are maybe not the most fun. But, the fact that they've chosen to do that suggests that it's okay because, well, if they didn't like it that much, they could choose not to. And, it seems like the choice in itself has some kind of value to that person, right? Okay, why it might be prior. So actually, a thing that I just mentioned that's kind of on the borderline is trying to reduce to utility without talking about agency might not work, just because people often have a kind of brute preference for agency. They like being able to decide things. They like having a choice. A lot of the time you can actually just, as an easy way to throw in a kind of simple metric of why your principle is important, is just to say, well, if you're a utilitarian, you probably think that it's probably likely that loads of people's strong preference being violated makes them upset, and X principle like democracy or national identity or agency or something is something that people just seem to care about a lot. And so we should just care about it on either side, because either it has some abstract principle value or it ends up having some instrumental value to utility, right? Another thing, people try and say not just that they're uncertain or kind of hard to tell what people's preferences are, but that kind of somewhat related to what I've just said, I suppose, that preferences are kind of intrinsically subjective, and that you have your own sort of self-defined notion of what a good life is anyway. So in order to say whether somebody's had a good life, it has to be based on what they choose anyway, because there's no higher authority. I don't know if I personally think that's actually true, but it's a lot of people run very sort of constructivist ideas about what moral value is, what moral obligations are, etc., along these lines, and it works for them. So you can try it. Okay, next thing. I've talked a little bit about this which is deontological stuff and rights. So deontology is the idea that some actions have sort of intrinsic moral permissibility or impermissibility or moral weight, which is not contingent on their consequences. It's kind of inherent to their nature, usually in relation to kind of certain moral rules, certain duties, certain principles that we shouldn't violate, right? And this is relevant to certain kinds of topics in debates. So whether it's okay to sacrifice the many for the few. So the stronger example of the organ donor thing is not just well, I'm going to be asleep and my kidney's going to get taken, but I'll be fine. But the example might be, well, somebody falls asleep in the hospital waiting room, and you can take out all their vital organs and they'll die, but it will save 10 people who need organ transplants immediately, right? It seems like a lot of people would say that this is morally wrong, even though it's consequentially at least giving the right caveats of things like, oh, nobody knows it's going to happen or something. Consequentially positive. Other examples, things like lying and deception, which I kind of mentioned earlier. Sometimes a lot of debates can be about whether it's good to be ignorant or to not know about, or to tell people lies or deceive them in a way that makes them happy, and you could give reasons as to why this is in principle wrong, because usually, for example, there's an idea that it's violating the kind of right to people to have a certain degree of sort of dignity and agency. Lastly, pleasure gained from illegitimate sources. So just briefly, utility might not be that the only metric if you're considering things like illegitimate sources of pleasure. An example of this might be a controversial one to an extent, but would be maybe the benefits that people might get from living in a state that they, or especially if it's their ancestors, kind of became able to live in through illegitimate means. Even if they get genuine pleasure from that and they're happy with it, it might not be valid in the same way that an indigenous person's right is. This is just an example. I'm not necessarily saying that I believe this, by the way, because it's founded on an injustice, and it's a benefit that is accruing from an injustice, and therefore it is not an acceptable thing in the same way as something else, right? And that the consequences are not just weighable over the principle. Okay, reasons that why you might try and show that deontology is important. So firstly, an interesting point you can make about deontology is that it seems to give more kind of common sense, arguably more reasonable conceptions of like moral responsibility. As in, if we point out that like morality is more about not violating certain kind of values, except for obviously if you're saying you should never lie or something, which is a pretty hard moral burden, this seems to give you a kind of limited moral scope where it says, well, you're responsible for your own actions and your own impact on the world, but like, for example, you have less moral obligations to like prevent all the abstract suffering that's happening that is kind of outside of your outside of your life and not being done by you, even if there's something in principle you could do to affect it, compared to direct actions that you do, right? Like, so for example, most people probably think that like murdering somebody is worse than deciding not to give the amount of money to charity that I probably have that would save one person's life in a developing country or something. And that's to do with like probably like arguably to do with moral responsibility, but having a kind of deontological nature where there's certain actions that are bad, and that's different to just the kind of inaction that causes a lack of perfect outcome. Secondly, just brute intuition, as I said with like the organ donor case, it seems like to most people, pure utilitarianism is just overly callous and kind of missing something about what it means to be moral in certain cases that you can just provide. Lastly, this is actually arguably like basically real utilitarianism. I'm not going to go down a tangent on what that is too much, but often you can think about deontology, especially if it's debate more about like a narrative or about moral rules in a broader sense than like in terms of implementing moral rules, for example. You might say that, well, one of the important values is sort of semi-consequentialist, but in a more sort of enlightened, broad way, where, for example, maybe for instance, it would probably be conceivably good in some instances for the state to be able to like detain people more easily without cause. Like if they had intelligence that they're like maybe going to commit a terror attack or something, but they don't have good enough evidence to hold them under like typical kind of liberal democratic legal systems. It could be good for utility in the short term, but like having the rule that you can't do that is generally good, right? Because it stops your state from being able to abuse people's rights in general, like make them, exploit it to suppress their enemies or make people live in fear that the state's going to repress them or whatever, right? And this is an example of kind of rule utilitarianism. Another I want to make, which is related to the cases about things like organ donation, briefly, is that people seem to assume in debating a lot of the time, and I've only like once talked about the opposite of this in debating, though it did go successfully. So they tend to assume that deontology has to be absolute, as in, if you're saying that you shouldn't do X because it's a bad thing, you have to prove that it's like always bad, even if the consequences are huge. This is not in principle true. You can have like what is called like threshold deontology, where you say that something like the inhibition against lying or something, or bodily autonomy violations, for instance, have moral weight that is significant, as in it makes it the case that you shouldn't do certain things that would have a high utilitarian outcome, but they are not infinitely weighted. And this can be used strategically, at least I think so. I've only done it once, as I said, as a way to run deontology without having as high a burden to explain that like really extreme cases are also on your side. So, for example, you probably think it's fucked up to like take the one person's organs to save the other people in the hospital, and if it's going to kill them, right? But if there's like one person in the world whose blood could like cure cancer, and they're like refusing to give their blood just because they're like an asshole, you might think, well, we should just take the blood and just use it to cure cancer because like it's going to save like millions of people, right? And that suggests that maybe there could be kind of deontic moral principles which are true, but just not infinitely weighted, right? As in, bodily autonomy violations are bad, but they're not so bad that they're never worse than the outcome of not committing them. Okay, last one, I think. No, sorry, two more. Okay, obligations, responsibilities, and reparations. So the TLDR of this is that some actors owe things morally to other actors, either due to implicit or sometimes explicit agreements. So a good example of that would be like the instance I gave earlier of your employer, how they are supposed to pay you, or maybe due to their status and their kind of power. So like maybe the government, because of its power, has certain obligations because they can do things that nobody else can, or to correct for wrongdoings, and that's like reparations, right? So providing amends to victims. So these are relevant to things to do with state obligations, for example, to their citizens, or nations' obligations to particular minority communities or ex-colonies or something like, victims of their own abuse. That's a kind of reparation case. There's also things to do with interpersonal obligations, like in your relations, like romantic relationships, family relationships, etc. So like a good intuition book I like to use is, I think most people would probably agree with this, that if my mother or something, if I was going to be homeless or something because I was financially struggling, and I use this in malaria nets example a lot, instead of giving me a few £100 to stop me from becoming homeless, my mother's like, well, I'm going to give the same amount of money to malaria nets or something because it's going to save a couple of lives in developing country. A lot of people might think that there's something morally bad about that, even though they're doing something again that's utilitarian, because presumably parents have particular moral rights to children that they should uphold even in non-usual cases. You can have different intuitions, I'm sure, but I think that's quite intuitive. And that's an example of interpersonal intuitions and how it could potentially, and something that could potentially play into debate about, for example, balancing family and interpersonal stuff against more kind of broad issues. And economic obligations, so that again, your boss's obligation to pay you, your rights, whether you should be made to pay taxes and all those kinds of things. Why are they important? So greater than utility, you might say, for example, you might have a kind of contractualist, again, kind of constructivist idea of ethics, where you say, well, the notion of kind of treating like with having reciprocal obligations is sort of what grounds morality in the first place, treat others as you want to be treated, etc. That you have to have kind of a social contract. And secondly, in terms of priorness, you might talk about things like the scope of moral responsibility being central. So that's kind of like the example of the parent, right? So you can talk about utility, but utilitarianism assumes that there's just an infinite scope of moral responsibility to anything that can suffer or have pain, right? Or have pleasure. But that's a premise of utilitarianism that is just assumed by it, right? So what you can argue is well, no, that's not necessarily true, right? The scope of moral responsibility, if we think about examples like the parent, right, might be more complicated. There might be certain people that you have certain relations to, you have more obligations to treat in certain ways than others. And it seems like these kind of considerations of obligations and responsibilities, etc., are kind of prior and foundational to determining that in the first place. So we would have to consider them before we can really weigh the importance of utility, right? But even if you're being less abstract, then you can obviously just say the broader point that, well, sometimes a utile benefit is less important just because of the moral obligation existing. You can do it either way. Okay, and the last one is anti-hedonism. So hedonism is the view that what makes life valuable, as in what gives somebody's well-being, as in what makes their life good or bad, not valuable in do they have right sense, is the amount of pleasure or pain that it has in it, right? That's what determines its value or its goodness. So the TLDR of anti-hedonism is just what makes one's life good is not reducible solely to pleasure and suffering. So it might appeal to achievements in your life, to actually, so for example, when you have these debates about, as I've said here, willful blissful ignorance, the experience machine or something, you might say, well, actually being in a relationship with somebody who loves you and cares about you or something, or actually interacting with those people that you care about is more important than, or has more value and distinct value from perceiving that you're doing so, right? Even if you're getting the same pleasure, because you can't tell the difference, there is a difference in fact, which is morally and kind of even prudentially important in terms of what is good for the person in them of themselves. So that, as I said, it can be useful to things like experience machine debates, to things about well, why is it bad that your partner is cheating on you if you never found out or something? Things about general finding meaning in life. A lot of the time
when you talk about things like finding meaning in life, and relatedly often why therefore sort of certain suffering or something is worthwhile, because it is what necessary to provide some certain type of meaning. You're going to be appealing not just to, you know, abstract pleasure and pain, but to like achievements, you know. So like classic example is, you know, actually climbing Mount Everest, or like being the first person to do that, or actually, you know, writing some amazing novel is just more significant and more meaningful in a absolute sense than thinking like just having the simulated experience of writing the perfect, amazing novel or something, right? Yeah, and the importance is kind of relatedly this idea of giving life a higher purpose, and somewhat more controversially than others probably, but I think there's an intuitive appeal in terms of, with the classic thing of the experience machine, the point is to prove that even if you have maximum pleasure in the experience machine, it's not the best possible life. So you might think it's better than like most people's lives. I don't know, it depends how pessimistic you are maybe, or how much you care about hedonism. But you probably at least would think, even if you think it is better than most people's lives, that the life that's actually where you actually live out all your best things and you're really happy, but you're also doing all these things, like I said, like you're actually in relationships or something, is more important than is more preferable than the one where you're doing all the same stuff just in simulation or something. And if you're just a hedonist, there should be no moral distinction between these two things. So that's the kind of force of the intuition, and it can be relevant to certain kinds of debates, especially sort of out-rounds about weird stuff that people like to say. Okay, so this is the last slide. So I've given you an overview of the strategy of when you should use principles, of how to generate material, of how to deliver principles, and a little bit about different concepts. There are many other useful principle presentations you can find on YouTube to get further information on this. Hopefully this was helpful. Thank you for watching. My name is Alastair, as I mentioned at the beginning. Goodbye.